Hi everyone, and welcome to the lecture on one of Russia's most famous and most influential writers, Anton Pavlovich Chekhov. Chekhov is somewhat different from the previous writers we've talked about in that he is from a much lower class background. He was born in 1860 in Taganrog in southern Russia on the Sea of Azov, and his father's father was a serf, so his grandfather was a serf, and his grandmother was Ukrainian. His father's mother was Ukrainian, so he was partially of Ukrainian extraction. He grew up in a lower middle-class household, or petit bourgeois household. His father ran a grocery store until going bankrupt in the 1870s, at which point the whole family other than Chekhov moved to Moscow. Chekhov himself, who was a teenager at the time, stayed by himself in Taganrog to finish his high school education. Chekhov's childhood was much less idyllic than the childhoods of some of the other authors we've discussed so far. It was marked by abuse, both mental and physical, mainly by his father. His mother was a very imaginative and artistic woman, and he said that he got his soul from his mother, but his father was cruel and abusive to the entire family. Later in life, Chekhov said something along the lines of, "Don't tell me that progress isn't real. When I was a child, I used to get beaten, and then as I got older, I stopped getting beaten, and it was definitely an improvement." We can see Chekhov's interest in abuse and unhappy families in his later works, as, for example, in Spat Хочется. In order to finish high school, Chekhov had to pay for his tuition as well as support his family who were living in Moscow. One of the ways that he did so was selling short stories to newspapers and journals. So already as a teenager, he was making a name for himself as a writer and earning money on the side by selling his short stories. After finishing high school, he moved to Moscow in 1879 and enrolled in medical school there. He was still supporting himself and the rest of his family by selling his work, his literary works. Unfortunately, at that time, he also contracted tuberculosis, which was ravaging the cities of Europe in the late 19th century. However, for the most part, he was healthy enough to continue writing and finishing med school, and his stories began attracting praise and interest from literary critics and readers in the 1880s. Here's a picture of Chekhov on the left with his older brother on the right. Chekhov's early short stories, which he wrote while he was in med school and in his early career as a doctor, were often satirical and humorous, not really like the Chekhov we think of today. And they often had harsh or crude aspects. For example, there's one about a young lady who ends up naked and has to hide in the case for a bass violin, various sorts of embarrassing and crude aspects to the stories of that time. Remember, he was writing for money, trying to put himself through med school and keep his family from starving, as he was developing the early signs of tuberculosis. As a doctor, he knew that he had tuberculosis, but he was afraid to confirm it by having himself examined by other doctors. So he knew he had it, but he was pretending that he didn't have it. Nonetheless, despite his money and health problems, his literary output was prodigious, and he wrote many, many short stories at the time. His most famous work from that period is probably Death of a Clerk, or Smert Chinovnika, which came out in 1883 under the pseudonym of A or Antosha Chichonte. At the time, Chekhov was often writing under pseudonyms, of which the most common was Antosha Chichonte. As a side note, Chekhov means Czech, as in someone from the Czech Republic. Chichonte probably sounds something like Chuchonitz, which is a slang word for Finn. It's an insulting slang word for Finnish person. It also sounds kind of like chichat or chichnut, to sneeze. And this is related to Smert Chinovnika, which is all about a sneeze. A low-level clerk sneezes at the theater and disturbs a higher-level bureaucrat, and then follows him around for days trying to apologize. And when the higher-level bureaucrat tells him to go home, he goes home and he dies from his shame and embarrassment. Death of a Clerk is often seen as a reworking of Gogol's The Overcoat. It has a similar focus on the little man, Маленький человек, whom we discussed in relation to Pushkin's Stansiony Смотритель and Gogol's Nos. But Chekhov had a different focus. He did want people to feel pity and sympathy for these little men, these little people, but he also wanted to emphasize their own free will and the way in which they often brought their oppression and their sorrows down on himself. And this was a focus that he had throughout his career, both on the ways in which society oppresses people, but also on the way in which oppressed people participate in their own oppression. Throughout the 1880s, Chekhov continued to attract considerable critical praise for his literary work, and he ended up winning a major prize, the Pushkin Prize, in the late 1880s. This encouraged him to try longer works, so he wrote a novella, The Steppe or Step, as well as a number of short stories, which was his preferred form at the time. Several of the short stories that he wrote were about peasants, such as Sleepy or Spotshochitsa, and peasant women or Babli. And he wrote a whole trilogy about peasants, Babli, peasant women, Muzhiki, peasants, and Vavragya in the ravine. Like Turgenev, he was interested in portraying the lives of peasants realistically and sympathetically, but his peasants are much less good, much less sympathetic in many ways than Turgenev's peasants. He, again, was very interested in how oppressed people participated in their own oppression, how they oppressed others of similarly oppressed classes, and how they could break free from their self-imposed oppression. For example, one of his most famous quotes is, "Write me a story about a young man, the son of a serf, who squeezes the slave out of himself drop by drop, until he wakes up one fine morning and realizes that in his veins flows not the blood of a slave, but of a real human being." And this seems very autobiographical. Chekhov, of course, was the grandson of a serf, of a slave, and he grew up in a very abusive household, one that was marked by the abuse and oppression that slaves or serfs had received. And he was very interested in how he could become a cultured person, a better person, and how people who had grown up or in some way been marked by abuse and oppression could squeeze that oppression out of themselves, squeeze that slave behavior and that desire to continue the cycle of oppression out of themselves and become good people. As a fun side note, in the movie Styliagi or Hipsters, one of the characters recycles that quote, which is very famous in Russian, and turns it into, how can you squeeze the blood of a square out of yourself? How can you become a hipster by squeezing the blood of a square or a boring person out of yourself? He was also very interested in moral issues, but his moral issues were often portrayed in shades of gray, or always portrayed with shades of gray, and he rarely laid out in his work specific moral ideas or ethical precepts to follow. So unlike Tolstoy, who tells you exactly what he thinks you should think, Chekhov tells you not even what he thinks, he shows you what his characters are thinking, and then allows you to come to your own conclusions most of the time. And so he said, for example, an enormously vast field lies between God exists and there is no God. The truly wise man traverses it with great difficulty. A Russian knows one or the other of these two extremes, but is not interested in the middle ground. He usually knows nothing or very little. And that's somewhat reminiscent of Dostoevsky and his remark in The Brothers Karamazov, how human nature, especially Russian nature, is broad, maybe too broad. We need to narrow it. And Chekhov saw people, especially Russians, as having this broad nature, but existing on one end of the pole or the other of this tremendous broadness of human nature. And he said that he was interested not in the poles, not in one end or the other, but in the middle. He wanted to explore, he says later in the quote, that he wants to explore this vast field between God exists and there is no God, and explore that middle ground of human nature. Although Chekhov denied that he was experimenting in form, he was experimenting in form, and he was very interested in formal aspects of writing. He was one of the main practitioners of a style of writing that we still use a lot today, especially in English language writing, especially American writing, that he was a proponent of very stripped down, bare, simple writing where everything that was there had its place. And so one of his most famous quotes is, "If in the first act you introduce a gun, then by the third act you must use it." He believed that everything that you had in a story should be there for a purpose, and if you introduced something, you then needed to use it. You couldn't just have stuff around there for color. You needed to have it there for some reason. Which is not to say that he did not have free motifs in his work. You could argue that he does have free motifs in his work, but his work is much more stripped down than work by, for example, Gogol or Dostoevsky. He also famously said that the best thing to do when you write something is to write a story, and then throw away the first and last pages because that's where authors do most of their lying. So get rid of your beginning and your end and just jump straight into the meat of the story. Although for most of his career, Chekhov mainly wrote short stories and mainly focused on peasants or the bourgeois, he's most famous, especially in the West, for his drama. And he was interested in drama all along, but it wasn't until the 1890s that he really began writing drama seriously. He wrote 4 famous plays, his 4 great plays. So just like Dostoevsky had 4 great novels, Chekhov had 4 great plays that he wrote and that were produced in the 1890s and early 1900s, and had mixed success at the time, but totally revolutionized theater later. His first great play was Chaika, or The Seagull, which you may have heard of, and there's now a famous theater in Moscow called Chaika, or The Seagull, named in honor of him. There's also a car called Chaika, named in honor of him, probably. And when it came out in 1896, however, Chaika was a resounding failure, and he considered stopping writing drama entirely. Fortunately, he was convinced to try his hand again, and he wrote several more plays, and Chaika was restaged in 1898, and this time it was a big success. That part of his problem with his plays was that actors and directors and producers needed to figure out a new way of performing them, that the old 19th century way of performing them no longer worked for these plays. These plays needed some new, modern innovation in acting and performing. Probably his most famous play, at least in the West, is Uncle Vanya, or Dядя Vanya, which came out in 1898 and met with more success. Again, like everything he did, like all his plays, it met with a mixed reception, but achieved a fair amount of success. If you're interested in watching it, there are many productions of Uncle Vanya available, including Vanya on 42nd Street, a film about an American company performing Uncle Vanya. Three Sisters, or Tri Sestry, which was performed for the first time in 1901, also received a mixed reception, but then went on to achieve success. And his final play, which was first performed in 1904, just a few months before he died, met with much success, although again at first people were kind of like, what is this? But The Cherry Orchard, or Vishnyovy Sad, which may be his most innovative, most impressionist, symbolist, whatever you want to call it, most fascinating play, like everything else that he did, was a little bit unexpected when it came out, and it took people a little while to get used to it. But once they did, they realized how fantastic it was and how it was something really new and exciting in Russian drama. One of the reasons for the later success of Chekhov's drama was the fact that Konstantin Stanislavski, the great early 20th century actor and director, took it on, and Stanislavski had to create a new way of performing in order to perform Chekhov's dramas in a way that showed them off to their best advantage and revealed what was really there in them. And we now know this as method acting. So what we now call method acting was originally something created by Stanislavski as a response to his, at times, somewhat frustrating experiences with trying to perform Chekhov's plays. And shortly after The Cherry Orchard debuted on the stage, Chekhov unfortunately died as a result of the complications of the tuberculosis that he'd had for 20-something years at the time. So he did not live a terribly long life, but he was incredibly productive, managing to produce some of the most well-known and most influential dramatic works of the 20th century, as well as numerous well-known and influential short stories, all while working as a doctor and doing other things such as traveling out to the convict community, the penal colony on Sakhalin Islands in eastern Siberia. So despite his relatively short life, he managed to fill it with an amazing amount of social work and literary work. And here are some questions for your reading. And by the way, here's a picture in the PowerPoint of Chekhov sitting next to Tolstoy together in Yalta. Tolstoy and Chekhov had a great deal of mutual admiration for each other and read each other's work and finally met in 1900 in Yalta. So one question to consider is, how are their works similar and different? They're obviously very different, and yet they had a tremendous amount of mutual respect. Why do you think that is? Another question is, how does Spát Хочется differ from earlier short stories we've read? We've just been reading short stories. How are they different? What has Chekhov done that's new and interesting? And do you think it's a realist work? How or how is it not a realist work? In a similar vein, is it an impressionist work? How or how not? And finally, how does it reflect or not reflect the Chekhov quotes from earlier in the lecture? How is it reflecting this great field between God exists and God does not exist? How does it reflect the idea of squeezing the slave from your veins drop by drop? And how does it reflect the idea of, if you have a gun on the wall in the first act, it needs to go off by the third act? How do we see that, or do we see that? Maybe we don't see that in Spát Хочется. How representative do you think it is of Chekhov's ideas and Chekhov's work? So there you go. Happy reading, everyone.